for your fantastic event. I will share my screen. Please let me know if you see it.
Perfect. It's perfect.
All right. Thanks again for the kind invite, and I'm very excited about really engaging with our colleagues in Portugal about such important topics about heritage interventions. I'm very familiar with the work that you do, and Portugal is a very rich country with a fantastic heritage of multiple levels. I also appreciate the work of Aga Khan. I do some work and reviews for them from time to time, so they are really a fantastic organization in that regard, which is unique arrangement between Portugal and Aga Khan, a unique program, and well done to everyone involved. My talk today, I am, as Professor Marquez mentioned, I am the director for the Center for Architecture, Urbanism and Global Heritage at Nottingham Trent University. And we do a variety of research projects and collaborations in different parts of the world. But I will focus my talk today about the use of virtual heritage technologies and how this really helps us to see certain things about architecture history or about building conservation that we don't normally have had access to before, and how this helps us to really provide a kind of new experiences, new learning process about the buildings that we deal with in the 21st century. So first, I'll just give you a brief note about the center that we operate. We are based in Arkwright Building, which is a 19th century historic building, which is, interestingly, it is now part of Nottingham Trent University, but initially was an art college, a natural history museums, and a public library, a unique typology that is really no longer exists at the moment. And it tells you that is actually how buildings change with time and how they are repurposed on a frequent basis, which is at the core of architecture and urban heritage. We are very glad to be award winning. So we just 3 weeks ago, we were notified that we have won the Queen's Anniversary Prize for our research on cultural heritage in the UK, which is one of the biggest prizes in the country, but we are also have been shortlisted for Newton Prize, and we have multiple awards, and we are currently members of the UNESCO UNITWEN network on tourism, heritage and culture. I will start my talk with an interesting story from the colleagues or students that were attending today who have ever been to Berlin. There is always one of the exciting architecture tours of Berlin is about going through Karl Marx Alley. And Karl Marx Alley is part of the Eastern Berlin. It really demarcates a large history about the social realism in Eastern Germany. But what's interesting about it, in the walk that we had with our students around 6 or 7 years ago, we just dropped by a cafe, a normal coffee shop on the street called Café Sibel. And when we went into it, just inside it, we found that a very fantastic arrangement of the history of that street and this alley, which is the longest, one of the longest in Berlin. Interesting is that you just find that as social enterprise, a local community coffee shop have really done the effort to really gather a lot of historic information about the story of that street, of that alley. And apparently it was named initially as a Stalin alley. So it is named, has changed, of course, because of the post-communist era. But what's interesting here is that they have re-provided some elements of that left behind history of Eastern Germany, from the telephones that were in those apartments at the time, some of the brick walls, some of the arrangements, and a very interesting history of the architecture and the architecture of the era. Sometimes that we walk down historical pathways or streets in our cities, and we don't realize how much knowledge is embedded into that, on those buildings and conservation. Maybe you conserve them, but how much information and knowledge you know about them and why they are significant in the first place. I think Café Sibel did an excellent job. Is just trying to really educate the public, educate people, passers-by, or maybe consumers, about how significant each piece of the architecture on the street. It's a conservative street, but it was the peak of the social realism in Eastern Germany, and was there made on the basis that it actually defines the communist ideas and agendas about urban design, about the equal representation of individuals, but actually it's about communism, an expression in a sense. it was it was a kind of a period that dedicated to really political ideology of the era, and this how that ideology has translated into buildings. So perhaps when you walk past, you would think why they are still preserving that building, those kind of series of buildings, and they are just a mass structure of housing with a huge construction concrete structures with concrete apartments of a smaller unit, but effectively in a way that defined a major pathway within the heart of the city. So it was a kind of an experimental model at the time in Eastern Berlin about the socialist states, how such a style of architecture and urbanism would have really defined such kind of directions, how it could really generate a kind of a new typology that should be followed in different parts of communist Europe at the time. Interestingly, this has changed, and the only sad story that this KPC Belgium I used to visit every time I visit Berlin with my students, but it shut down because of the lack of funding. And this brings you another thing about the challenge of conservation or heritage management. It's just you cannot really preserve them on a public, on a community or charity funding for a long time. So there is always some kind of a top-down approach to heritage preservation that enables this preservation of the long term. But moving to a different context, and here is just an example of how a smaller community initiatives really manage to really educate and preserve large chunks of that history and educate the public around it. But on another hand, you will have the other extreme, how architectural heritage becomes vulnerable to any case, to any institution, any instance of conflict and wars. And of course, in Europe, we have plenty of examples, but the most explicit examples that you see in places in the Middle East, for example, in Syria and Iraq, Libya and Yemen and others. But the same story, we had it before in the Balkan Wars in 1990s, Bosnia and Serbia, when a lot of historic buildings have been destroyed deliberately as part of the effort of the ideological wars. Here in Mosul, we had a project that we have been working on for the past 3 years. And Mosul is a city in the Middle East, which has the most diverse population and culture, where Judaism and Christianity and Muslims, or Christians and Muslims, lived side by side for generations, have their own synagogues adjacent to churches and adjacent to their mosques. Yet with the war and ISIS war and terrorism that had really plagued this part of the world, they have deliberately destroyed almost 90% of the old city. So the whole historic city that is showcased how diverse cultures and diverse community and ethnic groups can live together for centuries. This has gone. What's interesting here is just when we are talking about the destruction of historic buildings, what you don't realize that's what are wiped out with that destruction. So you can see here why one of the two remarkable images that came out of Mosul in post-war. When you have a whole market city, and the city of Mosul was basically an active trade hub in northern Iraq, which is people descend to it on every weekend to trade and exchange knowledge and exchange culture and exchange practice and goods, of course. But with the vast destruction of many of those streets now, what is you are left with is just a remnant of structures that do not really communicate to any kind of heritage, yet they have been there active for centuries. What is more devastating, that is, as you can see here, a single small mosque within a whole neighborhood that has been totally destroyed is the focal point of a certain festivities, and this is Eid festival in the center of Mosul. Here, just this a single structure within a largely devastated neighborhood. It just shows that there is still element of attachment between activities to a certain buildings. So in our work in Mosul, we try to really digitize and try to see what kind of trades. What's interesting here is just you have 90% of the cultural practice, intangible heritage, dress, food, communities have already migrated because they have become displaced because of the war. And all that means that effectively evaporation and disappearance of a huge range of practices. This brings us to the key element here about really how we can preserve heritage that is on decline, or perhaps you cannot really maintain it for long, whether it's Capacebel in Germany or in the old markets of Mosul, they cannot really continue to live forever. So there is always elements of disappearance, and we all understand that urban heritage is about dynamism, about change. You can conserve, but you cannot conserve everything. You can really manage certain historic fabric and structures, but you need to make sure that they are viable for the future, but at the same time, when they disappear, what you can do about it. Some of this where it becomes really good part for us to start to explore how digital technology helps in that. While you cannot really, of course, preserve and record people's history if they disappear from a place, but there are elements about memories, about how buildings demarcate certain historic practices. So buildings here are become agents of that memory. So people can really look at image or a historic space or become within a building. And what's important here, how that building communicates knowledge about the past, how it actually informs the way that we act today. And we use this laser scanning and digital technologies to try to document and record those historic buildings, especially mostly the vulnerable ones, and try to generate either a database or try to generate virtual elements out of it. Here we use digital technologies not only to create beautiful images, but actually to try to record the architectonics, the details, the structures, elements, and architecture decorations that is disappear with time. And this comes to a point where you have to ask your question. If we are now in a more mobile, digital, driven and digital technologies driven societies, young people and communities, how can virtual heritage technologies become an agent for heritage protections? How we can tell people if you are destroying buildings, we have a digital versions of it, or we cannot, it will disappear forever. Or how we can really provide the record that if we need it, as it happened in the Rotterdam Cathedral, you can still preserve it again and return, put it back in shape. Here, this stems from our own architecture research on architecture history and urban heritage. We always look at architectural heritage and buildings as part of the contemporary society, not just only a remnant of the past. We are not really looking at all the historic buildings within our historic cities or structures as something like an open museums, as some look at it. But as professionals, as an architects, we look at them as a viable element of the current landscape. Memory, historic buildings actually capture or embody our everyday activities, the way that we operate, the way that we walk down the city, and even the way that we culturally and socially interact with each other. In a way, they are the evidence why we do things we do today. And memory, in that sense, is a fabric of a community's way of life, as we know from William Booth. So if we are looking at some historic structures, what will make it more valuable for people? Maybe we as architects, we can preserve a nice historic walls or historic facades or historic spaces. But what's more important is actually how to merge the experience on the social and cultural history, the intangibles that took place on those spaces. So we are talking here about the events, about the time, about the space, about the interactivities that took place within the space. So it becomes first more accessible for the normal public, but at the same time help us to understand the role of that building or that historic street, or that street fabric within the city today. In that case, that actually what we hope to achieve is always to try to transform the intangible heritage to become more tangible, more accessible, and more of a story. We learned that in a place like, in a country like the United Kingdom, you have far more historic structures, more than what you can really preserve or keep. So it's important to really attach certain stories with these things. Hence, in our looking at architecture as objects of remembrance, we try to really engage, create that social experience that is really brings the social interactions to the space, put it within a space and within a specific period of time. So effectively try to bridge the space on time in the narrating or creating that interesting history about history fabric becomes the central ethos for us. I will give you an example of my research, and I won't extend on historic Cairo because I know that our next speakers will talk about the Darb al-Ahmar, which is I am very familiar with and I appreciate and study it a lot, but I would be very excited to really learn more about it. But I'm originally from Egypt. I work at Nottingham Trent University, but I'm originally from Cairo. So one of my first avenues was try to explore how we can really analyze historic structures in places like Cairo with actually within the confines of our understanding of urban architecture heritage. Here, as you see from this slide, there is always, similar to many contemporary cities, there are always different parts of the city that connects to different historic eras. Cairo, in that sense, had several layers, of course, but one of them is medieval Islamic conservative ideology, which is really generated and developed over a millennia of history within Old Fabric, Mazy Street. But also you had a period of 19th century, which is most of its design and architecture was generated by Italian and French architects, modeled on Paris, on Haussmann's Paris, with the radial streets, very fantastic European style buildings. But here to really shed the light of how we can use technology or modeling here in the very first sense about really understanding spaces and historic buildings. We look at here an historic everyday life in Cairo. So by studying the archives, the history of people who lived on historic buildings, we started to understand, I myself started to understand how those buildings came about. Why a large courtyard house that was really very viable in early 19th century has become divided into smaller apartment buildings into the early 20th century. As you see on the right-hand side, this is a Darb al-Asfar, which is in an area similar to a Darb al-Ahmar, which will be the next speakers will be talking about it, which is meant in Arabic, the yellow alleyway. And yellow alleyway is connected to a certain fabric and study, and which is a coherent community of tradesmen working on certain trade and fabrication, but at the same time, there is a certain hierarchy. As you can see, there are large houses, as you can see at the top left, which is courtyards, but also you have the smaller apartment buildings towards that southwest. But so what you can see is that there is a distribution of roles, but what happens within those large courtyard houses, they have been divided by inheritance, different marriage, different siblings. Each one of them started to really get some part of their inheritance and then use it as a different assets, build it again, and then large buildings have been divided into smaller apartment buildings. So such way you start to study the history, and then you understand how those historic buildings have become about and how the currently urban fabric of this complex part of the city have really emerged. Then we use digital modeling to try to look at how the social activities within the space of the time could help us understand the scale of spaces. Here, this Beit al-Suhaimi, one of the largest and the most medieval marvels of historic Islamic historic cities in the Middle East, especially in Cairo. And throughout our restoration project, we really studied who lived in that house, how many families, and how they were distributed into quarters in a large complex. In such kind of complex that you will, as you can see here, you'll study that the huge scale within a normal house. So it's like a mini palace, yet it was only one of the religious scholars of Al-Azhar Mosque at the time. But it was divided into a number of different environments. So here we analyzed how the spaces were divided into different social groups, and each one has a different social privileges. While this was for a long time was really well celebrated as a historic marvel of the Middle Ages, but we did not really know much how people were gathered and sitting down on those spaces. So actually using digital modeling, spatial analysis, we managed to really understand how the building have come to its complex arrangements, where you will have the lower part, which here, as you can see in the section, the lower part, which is well mosaic and highly decorated, but actually this was only for the lower class people, while the host of the house really get people on the either side of that patio and then get sitting in a social order where the order, seniority, and position within community is key. But I won't dwell on that. It's just to try to really manage this kind of historic city and everyday life. We managed to understand through modeling the spaces and try to map this to social hierarchy of the community at the time. We managed to understand the meanings of those spaces, what kind of procedures and process of productions and movement within those spaces have taken place. Developing this research for the contemporary city, we understood now that to a large extent, much of that history could be really mapped, how it's explained only when you understand the event and the time and the social activity you take within a place. So the streets is narrow because it actually is the main social event and where people get together, but also make it a more safe and protected. So this, if we are talking about medieval history, but still we haven't talked about how digital heritage really help us to understand, or virtual models can really help us to understand contemporary society. Here is another example, is a lace market in history in Nottingham. This is another one of those long-term, almost 900 years of continuous history in the middle of Nottingham, where the lace and textile industry was at the peak in the height of the Industrial Revolution in late 18th century. This is where most of the lace in the UK was produced, designed, and fashioned, and textile fashion was really at the peak. To document it and to understand it, we have divided each building in that street to a kind of an individual task. And each one of our students, similar to yours, have really went to the archives, studied what is the story of behind that building, who lived in that building, when it was initially designed, what is the initial building and architect's story behind it, who lived within it, and what kind of different functions that has taken place. And as you can see on the left-hand side, that will be a different layers of behind every building. So there is a story embedded in what exists today. So walking down the street, you may not really look much about what's happening in some of those buildings, but if you analyze this, and this is a National Justice Museum, and it was a courthouse before, and was a number of different activities, you look at the details of how the structure came about and what's the story behind it. And we carry this on a number of different things. Here we laser scanned some of the most important and significant elements within that street, and then we have modeled them. And for laying the historic layers of what happened before, we were able to really produce a really very interesting 3D model of the whole street, connected and adjusting to kind of a layers of history. So what is every one of those buildings communicates a story, when it was designed, and how it could really put together in a sample. And we have generated an exhibition that have been really well preserved in the middle of the city, but also we have generated a number of video short films, what's the history of that city, the history of the lace market, what happened in certain places. And this is basically to try to really engage with the public with the history of their local communities. Then we moved to the next step for us, and we said, okay, if virtual technology and laser scanning are available to us, how we can really make better use of it to document large-scale historic sites. And here is why I'm very lucky to be sitting just close now to Nottingham Castle. Nottingham Castle is currently an exhibition, a museum that's connected to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, but it is the central piece of the British Civil War, which is effectively how the English history has been pivotally developed, and this where it's all centered around rebellion. But what we have done, we understood that the rich history of the castle, but the museum itself, nobody goes to it because they don't understand what's going on. So we did our homework and studied the history of the castle, different layers, but at the same time, we generated a virtual twin of the whole castle. So we did with the laser scanning, we went to the site and scanned the art galleries, the exhibitions, the surroundings around it. And what's a very interesting point, that this castle sits on a network of caves. If you don't know Nottingham, Nottingham is the medieval city, which is actually, you hear much about Robin Hood's story. And Robin Hood is mythically character that sits within Nottingham, and this based on the city sits on a 660 caves. As you can see here on the top left, when we did digitally scan the castle, you can easily connect it to the underground caves. And these are things that you will never see it in normal life, but just you have to see with digital modeling or the virtual scanning of it. So we have generated such kind of, we have scanned the whole site and its landscape, and we tried to use that effectively digital twin of the site while it was redeveloped recently. Through a certain 30 million sterling pounds preservation project, we were the only team that is really have laser scan for the whole site. So when architects have developed their own design and brought it to implementation, they found there's a lot of errors, there's a lot of mistakes because of lack of accuracy. So they have used our laser scanning model to correct some of the assumptions. One of the important things here, when you do that digital scanning of a certain site or historic building, you document it accurately at a certain point in time. And by that, you generate a diary in an effect. So this site has changed over time, and the galleries have changed because now they have a different attributes and different experiences because they have been redesigned. So effectively, the version that you see now on the screen is no longer exist as accurately as it should. But we have become now the guardian of that record and that archive. But then we can really, what helped us at the same time. So this is on the top left, this is Nottingham Castle sitting on the network of caves at the bottom of the hill, but there is a new landscape. But this does not overlook the fact that we have a digital version here, which we can look at it, we walk through it. It documented a set of statues at the front of the Ducal Palace that is no longer exists. I will try to really be quick here. And at the same time, when the building itself was closed for 2.5 years during the pandemic and because of the development, the heritage development, we managed to really generate a virtual tours of the castle. So people can really walk through the galleries, look at their paintings and actually engage with them to a certain way. For the sake of time, just we have a number of number of videos, just to quickly. So this is a video that we have. It's available online. So I hope that I don't know if you can see my. Sorry, maybe it's disconnected. No worries. We'll go back to my presentation. So this one, you can really walk through it and then you can look right and left and have a virtual experience of being in the gallery as it is in real life situation. Sorry. And part of this, we started to really use some of this work as a kind of generating a kind of curated galleries. Curated galleries here because it enables you to really operate in the virtual art form of a building. So actually we have the digital version of the whole castle and we work with artists. So local artists here who really create a kind of a very interesting experiences of being on the site, and on the site and then walk through it. And then just try to imagine how the future of that building will host and will hold and how we can really utilize virtual heritage for different applications. Then once we have done that, when the castle was reopened in June 2021, earlier this year, we have run an exhibition that where we have been, here is the gallery that we scanned 4 years earlier, and then it is how it is today. So people were actually sitting in the same gallery, seeing a version that's 3 years old, entirely new, entirely old design. It's a one layer of that history, but sitting and looking around them, and they can see it how it is now. So the picture at the top left is the one that of the gallery 3 years ago, and the one at the bottom, it is the gallery today. And this showed that you can really live in two eras of the same space at the same time. So it's actually engaging with the past, but also understand how the future holds. This is a very quick, I know that I'm about time, but this is because it's really relevant to Portugal, and this is Palace Almada Carvalhais in Lisbon. And because we have been working on this domain for some time, so we have been approached by ERA Archaeology, to really is because they have been developing some work on the preserving of the facade of the palace. So we did not really do the preservation, but we did some laser scanning and digital modeling of it. But I'm showing this because it shows certain things that laser scanners can do that architects and normal conservation work that cannot, which is, as you can see, it's actually captures everything. It's about the texture, about the details, about the archaeology and the tectonics of those buildings. But you can take them and generate the measured buildings and drawings out of them. So you can measure the temperature, the atmosphere, the elements, and this is how the facades came about, and this was in desperate need of preservation at the time. And this was 3 years ago, this was 2018. But interesting here, you can also, one thing good about this laser scanning and digital technology, it's captured even the wires flying, the rubble on the floor, the textures of the textile and the mosaics on the ceiling. So there are some elements of that atmosphere atmospherics of the space that you don't normally get. One project that we have been doing in India, for example, using the virtual heritage technologies, similar to what I did in Cairo just around 10 years ago, but now using laser technology. What we did, we started to really go through the villages of India, on the historic villages of India, but also we have been looking at Ahmedabad. And if you allow me, I will hope that this could appear for you so you can see how a historic part of Ahmedabad has been really captured in an interesting three-dimensional record of material culture. Can you see the video or not?
No, it's just a PowerPoint. Eventually, right. I'll get in another screen.
Yeah, I think I will stop share and reshare again, if that's okay for a second. It won't take long.
Okay.
So you see my Vimeo screen
yes,
now?
Yes, we can see the video now. It's perfect. It's loading.
All right.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you. So sorry, what happened? For whatever reason, it disconnected from my screen. So can you see it now? I think I'm enlarging it as much as I can.
Yes, it's without sound, correct?
Yeah, without sound.
Perfect.
So as you can see here, laser scanning moves and captures millions of 3D scanning. But what happens, it penetrates through the walls. It shows the material culture. It records things at the moment, even the clothes left behind, how people sit together. So this was an exercise we did with Sept University in India, which we captured a long strays of the material culture on those houses. And we associated that with the social and cultural records of people who lived in those places. So effectively, you can capture that moment in time, but you have a true picture of not only the buildings, not only the fabric of the building, but actually the culture of the place, how people sit, what kind of they eat, what here you can see the air conditioning hanging from a window. But this is in a real sense, this is actually what's heritage is about. It's not only for the sake of just nice architectural buildings, but also about really what's happening with all those buildings. So this is kind of a stream of research and technology that has been developing over the past 20 years, but now we are utilizing it to really provide an accurate pictures and driving actually some of the historic preservation strategies. But I have a long list of projects that I don't want to waste your time on it at the moment. But we applied this in India, we applied this in Jordan, we applied it in Iraq and different places. So I'm sorry, thanks a lot for your time, but there is much of this work that I can provide it for. One final thing, Professor Marquez, just we highlight to your students, if you have master's students studying now, we are currently have a fully funded PhD studentships in cultural heritage at Nottingham Trinity University. And while they're still studying masters, if they are planning, if they will finish in summer, they can apply for it. And which will help people really work with us on the virtual heritage technologies if it is relevant to their studies. Thank you ever so much. And sorry for taking a few more minutes from my time.